You're nothing but a racist Cuban wannabe white man." The words exploded across the Senate Banking Committee hearing room like a grenade thrown into a chapel. Maxine Waters stood at the witness table, her purple suit jacket vibrating with rage, her fingers stabbing the air toward Senator Ted Cruz, as if she could physically pierce him with her fury. "Harvard elitist Princeton prince, you sit there pretending to care about poor people while you take Wall Street money hand over fist." Waters' voice crescendoed with each accusation, her supporters behind her already finding their rhythm. "Racist, sellout, corporate puppet." Ted Cruz slowly closed the leather-bound volume of Supreme Court cases he'd been reviewing, his movements carrying the deliberate precision of a man who had learned long ago that haste was the enemy of victory. Behind his wire-rimmed glasses, his eyes remained fixed on Waters, with the clinical detachment of a surgeon studying a tumor. "Representative Waters," Cruz said, his voice carrying that distinctive nasal precision that had won championships at Princeton and persuaded Supreme Court justices, "I've argued before the highest court in our land 9 times. Your volume doesn't intimidate me. Your accusations don't wound me. But your crimes—" He reached beneath the table and withdrew a brown accordion folder, its tabs labeled with the meticulous care of a federal prosecutor. "Your crimes interest me greatly." Waters's next words died in her throat, as Cruz placed the folder on the table with the weight of inevitability. Each tab bore a label in his own careful handwriting: One United, Family Enrichment, Slate Mailers, Cuba Files, Incitement Pattern, District Abandonment. "Shall we discuss?" Cruz asked, his finger hovering over the first tab. "Who really takes Wall Street money?" The first tab opened with the whisper of paper against paper, but in the sudden silence of the hearing room, it might as well have been thunder. Cruz extracted documents with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years building cases that would withstand the scrutiny of 9 Supreme Court justices, someone who understood that truth properly presented was the most devastating weapon in any arsenal. October 2008. He began, his voice taking on the cadence of a prosecutor laying out a case to a jury. "The financial crisis is destroying banks across America. Minority-owned banks, already struggling with decades of systemic disadvantages, are failing at unprecedented rates. In Los Angeles alone, 5 such institutions are on the brink of collapse, 5 banks serving communities that desperately need them. And you, Representative Waters, as a senior member of the Financial Services Committee, had the power to help all of them." Produced a photograph first. One United Bank's logo gleaming on a building that looked far more prosperous than most community banks. One United Bank of Boston. Not Los Angeles, where your constituents live. Not even California. Boston. A bank in which your husband, Sidney Williams, just happened to own approximately $350,000 in stock. The timeline Cruz constructed was damning in its precision. Each document built upon the last like evidence in a murder trial, which, in a sense, it was. The murder of public trust. September 2008. One United receives a cease and desist order from the FDIC. The bank is insolvent, hemorrhaging money, facing imminent collapse due to reckless investments and executive excess. He produced the FDIC document, its official seals visible even from the gallery. The same executives who drove it into the ground were paying themselves millions while the bank burned. The CEO used bank funds to lease a $6.4 million beachfront mansion in Santa Monica, a Porsche, a Jaguar, all while the bank teetered on collapse. That's not, Waters began, but Cruz continued with the inexorable momentum of an avalanche. October 16, 2008. You personally arrange a meeting between One United executives and Treasury officials. Not a meeting for all minority banks, as you later claimed. A meeting specifically for One United. Here's the email trail. He laid out the emails like playing cards in a losing hand. Treasury officials expressing concern about the propriety of the meeting. One United executives bragging about their connection to Waters. And most damning, an internal Treasury memo. This appears to be a clear conflict of interest. Representative Waters is advocating for a specific bank in which her husband has a substantial financial stake. December 2008, One United receives $12 million in TARP funds, taxpayer money, bailout funds meant to stabilize the entire financial system. Cruz's voice hardened with genuine anger. Do you know how many minority-owned banks applied for TARP funds and were denied? 17? Do you know how many could have been saved with that $12 million? 5 banks serving communities from Watts to Compton to Inglewood. But they didn't have a congresswoman with a husband on their shareholder list. A stirring in the gallery drew attention to a man in his 60s wearing the conservative suit of a career civil servant. He stood slowly, as if the weight of years had finally become too much to bear. "My name is James Patterson," he said, his voice carrying the gravity of confession. "I was a Treasury official in 2008. I was in that meeting. Representative Waters called me personally 3 times. She said it was about helping all minority banks, but she only advocated for one. When I raised concerns about the conflict of interest, I was told to be more politically aware. I've lived with this for 17 years. I couldn't stay silent anymore." "Oh, thank you for your courage, Mr. Patterson," Cruz said, then turned back to Waters, whose face had progressed from anger through shock to something approaching fear. But the story doesn't end there, does it? Because One United didn't use that $12 million to help struggling homeowners or small businesses in minority communities. Would you like to know what they did with it? He produced bank records highlighted and annotated with forensic accounting precision. Executive bonuses, $1.8 million. The same executives who drove the bank to insolvency rewarded themselves with taxpayer money. Luxury purchases for the bank's image enhancement, $2.3 million. New corporate jets, upgraded offices, entertainment expenses. Actual community lending increase 0. Not one additional dollar went to help the communities you claim to champion. The Ethics Committee cleared me. Waters finally managed to interject, her voice lacking its earlier force. "The Ethics Committee was wrong," Cruz replied, with the calm certainty of someone stating that water was wet. "And I can prove it. Because what the Ethics Committee didn't have was this." He produced a new set of documents, these bearing more recent dates. 2019 through 2023. One United Bank political contributions. $247,000 to your campaigns and affiliated PACs. Your husband's stock, which should have been worthless when the bank failed, now worth $1.2 million thanks to that taxpayer bailout. In Texas, Representative Waters, we call that stealing with a fountain pen. The hearing room had transformed from a political theater into something more akin to a courtroom, with Cruz as prosecutor, the evidence as his witness, and Waters looking increasingly like a defendant who had just realized her lawyer had lied about her chances. "But One United was just the beginning," Cruz said, closing the first section and moving his hand to the second tab. "Because once you realized how easy it was to monetize your congressional seat, you turned it into a family business. Shall we discuss how your daughter Karen has made $1.2 million from your campaigns?" The second tab revealed its contents with the same methodical precision as the first. But these documents carried a different weight, the mundane evil of corruption dressed in the boring clothes of campaign finance reports. Cruz handled them with the disgust of someone forced to examine something particularly distasteful but necessary. Karen Waters. He began holding up a photograph of a middle-aged woman who bore an unmistakable resemblance to the representative. Your daughter. A talented woman, I'm sure. So talented, in fact, that she's been paid $1.2 million over 20 years for providing a single service to a single client, your campaigns. The scheme as Cruz laid it out was breathtaking in its simplicity and brazenness. Since 2004, Karen Waters had run a company called Progressive Connections, whose sole purpose was to produce slate mailers for her mother's campaigns. The mailers, those glossy cards that arrived in mailboxes telling voters which candidates Maxine Waters endorsed, had become a goldmine. Let's examine the fair market value of these services, Cruz said, producing comparison documents. Here's what other campaigns pay for identical slate mailers. The average cost $3,000 per mailing. Here's what your campaign pays your daughter $35,000 per mailing. That's a 1,000% markup. In the private sector, we'd call that fraud. In Congress, apparently, you call it family values. He displayed internal emails that painted a picture of nepotism so blatant it would have made a medieval monarch blush. Campaign staff questioning the exorbitant payments, Karen Waters demanding increases, and most damning Maxine Waters herself, directing staff to hide the true nature of the relationship. From your 2018 campaign manager, Cruz read from an email displayed on the screen, Maxine told me to list Karen as a consultant, not her daughter. She said the FEC doesn't need to know about family relationships. That's consciousness of guilt, Representative. That's knowing what you're doing is wrong and doing it anyway. But the financial impropriety went deeper than simple overpayment. Cruz produced tax documents that showed a sophisticated money laundering operation. The funds paid to Karen Waters didn't stay with her. They flowed through a network of shell companies eventually purchasing real estate luxury goods and investments that benefited the entire Waters family. Let me show you what $1.2 million in stolen campaign funds bought, Cruz said, displaying property records. A $750 $1,000 home in Windsor Hills purchased by Karen Waters in 2019. A $450,000 rental property in Inglewood purchased by your grandson in 2021. A $325,000 investment account opened by your sister in 2020. All traceable back to campaign payments for services that cost other campaigns a fraction of what you paid. A woman in the gallery stood abruptly, her face flushed with emotion. I donated to your campaigns, she shouted at Waters. $25 here, $50 there. I'm a teacher. I thought I was supporting someone who fought for us. You used my money to buy your daughter a house. Security moved toward her, but Cruz raised a hand. Let her speak. She has more right to be heard here than anyone. My name is Patricia Johnson, the woman continued, tears streaming down her face. I teach in Watts. I voted for you for 20 years. I told my students you were proof that someone who looked like us could make a difference. How do I explain this to them? How do I tell them their hero is just another thief? Waters tried to respond, but her words were drowned out by a recording Cruz began to play. The audio was crystal clear, a phone conversation between Waters and her daughter from 2021 obtained through a whistleblower in the campaign. Mom, I need another $50,000 this quarter. The mortgage on the new place is killing me. Don't worry, baby. We'll increase the mailer budget. Call it expanded voter outreach or something. Won't someone notice? Who's going to notice the FEC? They're toothless. The media, they're scared to come after a black woman. We're untouchable, baby. The word untouchable hung in the air like a curse finally coming due. Cruz let it resonate before continuing, his voice now carrying the righteous anger of a prosecutor confronting corruption. Untouchable, he repeated. You thought being a black woman in Congress made you untouchable. You weaponized your race and gender as shields for your crimes. Every time someone questioned your finances, you cried racism. Every time someone investigated your corruption, you claimed sexism. You turned the legitimate struggles of millions of Americans into your personal get-out-of-jail-free card. And he produced a compilation of statements Waters had made over the years, each one following revelation of financial impropriety. Racist attack after the One United scandal. Sexist persecution after questions about her daughter's payments. Right-wing conspiracy after every investigation. You know who you really hurt with this. Cruz asked, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow carried more weight than shouting. Every honest black woman in politics who now has to work twice as hard to be trusted because you taught America that some will use their identity as a shield for corruption. Every legitimate claim of racism that now gets met with skepticism because you cried wolf while your hand was in the till. He closed the second folder with deliberate finality. But the family enrichment scheme was just the appetizer. The real money came from your innovative approach to campaign finance. Your slate mailer operation that would make a mob protection racket look legitimate. Shall we examine how you've extorted $5 million from California politicians? The third section of Cruz's accordion folder bulged with more documents than the previous two combined, suggesting the depth of investigation required to unravel what Cruz was about to describe as the most innovative corruption scheme in modern American politics. He extracted the first batch of papers with the care of someone handling toxic waste. The slate mailer, Cruz began holding up one of the glossy cards for the gallery to see. A simple concept. Trusted politicians endorse candidates, and those endorsements are mailed to voters. It's been a staple of California politics for decades. But you, Representative Waters, you turned it into something else entirely. You turned it into a protection racket that would make the Gambino family proud. The mechanism, as Cruz explained it, was elegantly corrupt. Unlike other politicians who might endorse candidates based on shared values or policy positions, Waters had monetized her endorsements with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. Candidates who wanted her endorsement, and more importantly wanted to avoid her opposition, had to pay to be included on her slate mailers. The payments ranged from $5,000 for minor local candidates to $45,000 for statewide offices. But here's where it gets interesting, Cruz said, producing a spreadsheet that looked like the books of a criminal enterprise. These aren't campaign contributions, which would be subject to limits and disclosure requirements. These are payments for slate mailer services, a completely legal loophole that you've exploited to raise unlimited funds from unlimited sources. He displayed the numbers year by year. 2016, $280,000. 2018, $385,000. 2020, $510,000. 2022, $625,000. The progression showed a operation growing in both sophistication and brazenness. But you weren't content with just selling endorsements, Cruz continued. You turned it into extortion. Let me introduce evidence from former Assemblyman Robert Chen. A video played on the screen, a man in his 40s, clearly nervous, but determined, speaking to what appeared to be FBI investigators. I was running for re-election in 2020, Chen said on the recording. Maxine Waters's people contacted me. They said I could be on her slate mailer for $25,000. I declined. I didn't have that kind of money, and honestly, I didn't think I needed her endorsement. 2 weeks later, she endorsed my opponent. But that wasn't enough. She sent out a special mailer calling me an enemy of the black community and a tool of white supremacy. I'm Taiwanese American. I'd voted with her on every civil rights issue, but I didn't pay, so she tried to destroy me. Mr. Chen lost his election by 3-12 votes, Cruz noted. Post-election polling showed that Waters' attack mailer was the decisive factor. One politician's career destroyed because he wouldn't pay your protection money. But Chen wasn't alone. Cruz produced testimony after testimony from California politicians who had faced the same choice: pay Waters or face her wrath. A Latino city councilman who was labeled anti-black after refusing to pay. A black female mayor who was called a sellout to white interests after declining to participate. Even progressives who shared Waters' supposed values weren't immune if they didn't pay the toll. Let me show you where this money really went, Cruz said, returning to the financial documents. The slate mailer payments go to your campaign. From there, they follow a now familiar path. Your daughter's company gets contracts to produce the mailers at that 1,000% markup we discussed. The profits flow through the shell companies, and eventually, he produced real estate documents, investment statements, luxury purchase receipts. A $4.5 million mansion in Hancock Park. Not in your district, of course. You haven't lived in your district for decades. A portfolio of rental properties worth $3.2 million. A collection of luxury cars, all paid for with money extorted from California politicians who just wanted to serve their communities without paying your toll. But the most damaging part, Cruz said, producing a new set of documents, is who else was paying. Because it wasn't just candidates who needed your endorsements. Let me show you the corporate sponsors of your protection racket. The list read like a who's who of industries with business before the Financial Services Committee: Wells Fargo, Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs. Each had paid substantial sums for slate mailer inclusion that had nothing to do with any actual campaign. Fascinating how these payments preceded favorable treatment in committee, Cruz observed. Wells Fargo paid $75,000 in 2019, just before you helped kill stronger penalties for their fake accounts scandal. Bank of America paid $100,000 in 2020, right before you opposed breakup legislation. It's almost as if they were buying something other than slate mailer space. A young man in the gallery stood up, his entire body shaking with rage. My name is Marcus Thompson. I ran for Los Angeles City Council in 2022. I'm a Democrat. I agree with Representative Waters on almost every issue, but I'm also a high school teacher, and I couldn't afford her $30,000 fee. She not only endorsed my opponent, she called me a false progressive and a danger to the community. I lost by 147 votes. My crime: being too poor to pay her bribe. Thank you, Mr. Thompson, Cruz said gently. Your courage in speaking out is commendable. He turned back to Waters, whose face had progressed from anger through fear to something approaching desperation. This is what you've built, Representative Waters. A political machine that crushes anyone who won't pay tribute. You've turned democracy in California into a transaction where the price of participation is whatever you decide to charge. But Cruz wasn't finished. He pulled out one final document from this section, holding it up with particular disgust. This is perhaps the most reprehensible example. 2023. Maria Gonzalez running for school board in Inglewood. A 28-year-old teacher, first-generation American, running on a platform of improving education for kids who look just like the ones you claim to champion. She couldn't afford your $10,000, so you endorsed her opponent, a 67-year-old incumbent with 3 DUIs and a sexual harassment settlement. He won by 89 votes. Those kids in Inglewood, they're still stuck with failing schools because you valued $10,000 more than their futures. The weight of accusation hung in the air like smog over Los Angeles. Cruz closed the third section with the same deliberate care he'd shown throughout each movement, calculated to build toward an inevitable conclusion. $5 million, he summarized, extorted from politicians, corporations, and anyone else who needed to do business in your political ecosystem. But mere corruption wasn't enough for you, was it? You had to add ideology to the mix. Should we discuss your friends in Havana? Your hero who murdered a New Jersey state trooper, your pattern of siding with cop killers over cops. The fourth tab bore markings that suggested this section had required special handling classification stamps, chain of custody forms, and the kind of bureaucratic attention reserved for matters touching on national security. Cruz opened it with the solemnity of someone unveiling evidence of treason, which in his mind wasn't far from the truth. Let's discuss Assata Shakur. He began, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been present before. Born Joanne Chesimard, convicted of murdering New Jersey State Trooper Werner Forster in 1973. Sentenced to life in prison. Escaped in 1979 with the help of armed supporters who took guards hostage. Fled to Cuba, where she lives to this day under the protection of the communist regime. This is who you call a hero, Representative Waters. This is who you've spent decades defending. He produced a photograph, first Waters and Shakur in Havana, embracing like old friends, both smiling for the camera. The image quality suggested it had been taken by intelligence services rather than tourists. Your first documented visit to Shakur was in 1998. Cruz continued laying out a timeline that read like a dossier on a foreign agent. You've made 8 trips to Cuba over the past 25 years. Each time you've met with Shakur. Each time you've met with Cuban intelligence officials. And each time you've come back to America and advocated for policies that benefit the Castro regime. The letters Cruz produced next were perhaps the most damning evidence yet. Written in Waters' own hand on congressional letterhead, addressed to Fidel Castro himself. Let me read from your 1998 letter to Castro, Cruz said, his voice dripping with disgust. Dear Comandante Castro, I write to thank you for providing sanctuary to Assata Shakur and other victims of American political persecution. Your courage in standing up to American imperialism is an inspiration to oppressed people everywhere. I want to assure you that I will continue to work for an end to the cruel and unjust embargo against your nation. Victims of political persecution. Cruz repeated, his voice rising for the first time. A woman who shot a state trooper execution style is a victim. Let me tell you about the real victim. Werner Forster, 34 years old, father of 2. His daughter was 3 when Shakur murdered him. His son was 18 months old. They grew up without a father because your hero put a bullet in his head. He produced another document, a letter from Forster's widow, now in her 80s. Cruz read it with the reverence reserved for sacred texts. Every year on May 2nd, I visit my husband's grave. Every year I have to explain to his grandchildren why their grandfather isn't there. And every year I see politicians like Maxine celebrating his killer. She calls Assata a freedom fighter. I call her my husband's murderer. She says Assata was persecuted. I say she was prosecuted, convicted by a jury, and fled justice like the coward she is. Representative Waters has chosen to stand with a cop killer over a cop's widow. That tells you everything you need to know about her values. My father fled Cuba in 1957. Cruz said his personal investment in this issue now evident. He was tortured by Batista's regime. He came to America with nothing but hope. He washed dishes for 50 cents an hour to pay for college. He achieved the American dream through hard work and determination. And you, Representative Waters, you spit on that dream every time you praise the regime that has tortured and murdered thousands of Cubans whose only crime was wanting freedom. But Waters' support for Shakur was just the beginning. Cruz produced evidence of a broader pattern of support for violent extremists. Financial contributions to organizations with ties to domestic terrorism. Speeches at rallies where cop killers were celebrated as heroes. A consistent pattern of choosing violence over law, revolution over reform, extremism over democracy. 2016. Cruz read from a new document. You spoke at a rally for Mumia Abu Jamal, convicted of murdering Philadelphia police officer Daniel Faulkner. You called him a political prisoner and a voice for the voiceless. Officer Faulkner's voice has been silent since 1981 when Abu Jamal shot him in the face. Who speaks for him? 2018. You attended a fundraiser for Marilyn Buck, convicted of participating in the Brinks armored car robbery that left 2 police officers and a security guard dead. You called her a freedom fighter and a heroine of the struggle. 3 children lost their fathers that day. Are they part of your struggle? 2020. You wrote a letter supporting clemency for Susan Rosenberg, convicted of possessing 740 pounds of explosives intended for use against American targets. You called her prosecution politically motivated. Tell that to the people who would have died if she hadn't been caught. The pattern was clear and damning. Over decades, Waters had consistently aligned herself with those who used violence against law enforcement and innocent civilians. She had turned her congressional office into a support network for terrorists and cop killers, using her platform to legitimize their crimes and advocate for their release. But you didn't just support these criminals with words. Cruz continued producing financial records. You supported them with money, campaign funds directed to prisoner support networks, congressional resources used to advocate for convicted terrorists, taxpayer dollars funding your trips to Cuba to embrace a cop killer. A man in a police uniform stood in the gallery. His badge identified him as a sergeant with the Los Angeles Police Department. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. I'm Sergeant David Martinez, LAPD, for 22 years. I've worked in Representative Waters' district for most of that time. Every day, I and my fellow officers risk our lives to protect the people of South Los Angeles. And every day we know that their own representative stands with those who would murder us. How are we supposed to build trust with the community when their congresswoman celebrates cop killers? Waters tried to interject, shouting about police brutality and systemic racism, but Cruz cut her off with surgical precision. No one is denying that police reform is necessary, he said. No one is saying that there aren't serious issues that need to be addressed. But there's a difference between reform and revolution, between accountability and assassination. You've chosen the side of those who answer injustice with murder. You've chosen bullets over ballots, violence over votes, terrorism over democracy. He produced one final item from this section, a report from the FBI's Counterterrorism Division, heavily redacted, but still revealing. This report details your connections to individuals and organizations on terrorism watch lists, your communications with known extremists, your pattern of using congressional resources to support enemies of the United States. The FBI has been watching you for years, Representative Waters. They've built a case that would make any prosecutor salivate. The only reason you haven't been charged is political. But politics can only protect you for so long. Cruz closed the fourth section with visible relief, as if he had just finished handling something contaminated. Supporting cop killers and communist dictators would be enough to end most political careers. But you weren't content with that. You had to add incitement to violence to your resume. Should we discuss Brooklyn Center? Should we talk about how you poured gasoline on a city already on fire? The fifth section opened with video evidence that required no introduction. The footage from Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. April 17, 2021, had been played countless times on news channels, dissected by pundits, and debated in forums across the country. But Cruz presented it now with the clinical precision of a prosecutor establishing a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. On the screen, Waters appeared in the midst of a crowd already charged with tension over the police shooting of Daunte Wright. The scene was chaotic protesters, with signs police in riot gear forming lines, the air thick with smoke from previous night's unrest. And in the center of it all, a United States Congresswoman not calling for calm, but for escalation. "We've got to stay on the street," Waters' recorded voice filled the hearing room. "And we've got to get more active. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure that they know that we mean business." "More confrontational," Cruz repeated, pausing to let the words sink in. A city already experiencing violence, already seeing businesses burned and lives destroyed. And a member of Congress, someone sworn to uphold the law, calling for more confrontation. But this wasn't an isolated incident, was it? Representative Waters? This was part of a pattern going back years. He produced a compilation that his staff had clearly spent months assembling. Video after video of Waters at various protests and rallies, each one showing the same pattern, arriving at moments of tension and adding fuel to the fire rather than water to cool it. June 2018. Narrated over footage of Waters at a Los Angeles rally. "After separating yourself from your colleagues' call for civility, you told supporters, and I quote, 'If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore anywhere. Create a crowd. Push back. Not welcome anywhere," Cruz repeated. This is the language of mob rule, not democratic discourse. This is incitement, not inspiration. And your words had consequences. He displayed news reports from the following weeks. Trump administration officials harassed in restaurants, chased from movie theaters, confronted at their homes. Families with children terrified by mobs that felt empowered by a congresswoman's call to action. But let's return to Brooklyn Center, Cruz said, bringing the focus back to the most egregious example. Because your appearance there wasn't random, it wasn't spontaneous, it was calculated. He produced travel records and financial documents that painted a damning picture. Waters had flown to Minnesota not on commercial flights, but on a charter paid for by activist organizations with a history of violence. She had been briefed on the situation by groups that explicitly called for direct action against police. She had gone not as a voice of reason, but as an accelerant. And when you got there, Cruz continued, you didn't meet with community leaders seeking peace. You didn't visit black-owned businesses destroyed in previous night's riots. You went straight to the most volatile location you could find and threw matches at a powder keg. The next piece of evidence made even hardened political observers wince. It was a recording from inside the courtroom where Derek Chauvin was being tried for the murder of George Floyd. The judge, Peter Cahill, visibly frustrated, addressing the impact of Waters' comments. I'll give you that Congresswoman Waters may have given you something on appeal that may result in this whole trial being overturned, Judge Cahill said on the recording. This goes back to what I've been saying from the beginning. I wish elected officials would stop talking about this case, especially in a manner that is disrespectful to the rule of law and to the judicial branch and our function. A sitting judge, Cruz emphasized, stating that your comments could cause a murder trial to be overturned. Think about that. Your need for a spotlight, your hunger for relevance, almost allowed a convicted murderer to walk free. Is that justice, Representative Waters? Is that serving your community? But the consequences went far beyond legal technicalities. Cruz produced a series of photographs and videos that showed the real-world impact of Waters' incitement. Businesses burned to the ground. A Vietnamese immigrant's restaurant that had been in his family for 30 years reduced to ashes. A black-owned barbershop looted and destroyed. An elderly woman's car set on fire while she watched from her apartment window. Let me introduce you to some of your victims, Cruz said, gesturing to the gallery where several people had been waiting for this moment. A middle-aged Asian man stood first. My name is David Nguyen. My family's restaurant survived the Vietnam War, survived the journey to America, survived decades of hard work in a tough neighborhood. It didn't survive Maxine Waters. After you called for confrontation, they confronted us. They burned down our American dream because you told them to get more active. An elderly black woman stood next, leaning heavily on a cane. I'm Martha Washington. Lived in that neighborhood for 60 years. After your speech, the riots got worse. They burned down the pharmacy where I get my heart medication, the grocery store where I bought food. You don't live with the consequences of your words, Ms. Waters. We do. A young black man in a suit stood last. Marcus Freeman. I owned a barbershop on Lake Street. Started with nothing, built it up over 10 years. Gone in one night after you poured gasoline on our pain. You talk about fighting for black businesses. You got mine burned down. You talk about representing us. You've never even asked what we need, just assumed what would get you on TV. The testimony was devastating, not just for what it revealed, but for who was revealing it. These weren't political opponents or right-wing activists. These were Waters' own constituents, the people she claimed to champion, showing the real-world consequences of her inflammatory rhetoric. But here's the most damning part, Cruz said, producing financial records. Your pattern of incitement isn't just ideological, it's profitable. Let's look at your fundraising numbers after each of these incidents. The correlation was undeniable. After each inflammatory statement, each call for confrontation, each visit to a volatile situation, Waters' campaign donations spiked. June 2018 confrontation comments, $400,000 raised in the following week. Brooklyn Center appearance, $750,000 in donations. Every time she poured gasoline on a fire, her supporters rewarded her with cash. You've monetized division, Cruz stated flatly. You've turned racial pain into personal profit. Every riot is a fundraising opportunity. Every confrontation is a campaign event. You don't want peace because peace doesn't pay. You don't want solutions because solutions don't make headlines. He produced one final piece of evidence from this section, Waters' own campaign emails sent in the days following her controversial appearances. The subject lines told the story, "They're trying to silence me. The right-wing attacks continue. I need your support now more than ever." You create the controversy, then fundraise off the backlash, Cruz observed. It's a perpetual motion machine powered by division and paid for by people who think they're supporting justice but are really just funding your lifestyle. Cruz closed the fifth section with visible disgust. Inciting violence for profit, using racial pain as a personal ATM, turning communities' agony into your advancement. But perhaps the greatest betrayal is what you've done to the very district you claim to represent. Should we examine how the 43rd District of California has fared under your 30-plus years of leadership? The final tab in Cruz's accordion folder bore a simple label, District 43. But the documents within painted a picture of neglect and exploitation that transformed those two words into an indictment more damaging than all the financial crimes combined. "Let's talk about home," Cruz began, his voice softening slightly, carrying genuine sadness rather than prosecutorial fury. "Not your home in Hancock Park, Representative Waters, your $4.5 million mansion outside the district you supposedly represent. Let's talk about the homes of your constituents. The people who voted for you for over 30 years, believing your promises, trusting your words, waiting for the change that never comes." He produced a map, first, the 43rd Congressional District, outlined in red. The boundaries encompassed some of Los Angeles's most struggling neighborhoods, Watts, Willowbrook, parts of Gardena, and Inglewood, areas that had been promised revival for decades, but had instead seen steady decline under Waters' watch. "Let's start with some numbers," Cruz said, displaying statistics that painted a grim picture. Median household income in your district, $36,000. That's $31,000 below the national average. Poverty rate, 24.6%. Nearly 1 in 4 of your constituents lives below the poverty line. Unemployment, 15%, more than triple the national rate. These aren't just statistics, Representative Waters. These are your neighbors. Or they would be if you actually lived there. The next image showed Waters's actual residence, a stunning mansion in Hancock Park, one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods miles away from the poverty she claimed to fight. "You haven't lived in your district for decades," Cruz stated. "You don't shop where your constituents shop. You don't send your children to their schools. Your grandchildren go to private schools that cost more per year than most of your constituents make. You don't worship where they worship. You're not a representative. You're an absentee landlord collecting political rent." But the neglect went deeper than personal disconnection. Cruz produced a comprehensive analysis of Waters' legislative record over 3 decades, and the results were damning in their emptiness. 30 years in Congress, he read from the report. Number of bills you've authored that became law, 3. 3 bills in 30 years. And what earth-shattering legislation did you champion a bill to name a post office? A bill to modify a flood insurance program that doesn't even affect your district. And a bill to include Watts in a national heritage area. That's it. That's your legislative legacy. A post office and insurance tweak and a heritage designation. "But surely," Cruz continued with mock generosity, "you've brought federal resources to your district. Surely 3 decades of seniority on the Financial Services Committee has translated to investment in your community. The numbers told a different story. While Waters had been enriching herself and her family, her district had seen federal investment dry up. Community development grants down 40% during her tenure. Small business loans decreased by 50%. Educational funding stagnant for 20 years when adjusted for inflation. Meanwhile, Cruz noted producing contrasting statistics. Districts represented by junior members who actually fight for their constituents have seen double-digit increases in federal investment. They don't have your seniority, your committee positions, or your national profile. What they have is something you lost long ago, a genuine connection to the people they serve. A woman in the gallery stood, her dignity evident despite worn clothes that spoke of hard times. "My name is Angela Roberts. I've lived in Watts my whole life, 67 years. I voted for you every election since you first ran. My mama voted for you. My children voted for you. And what do we have to show for it? The same broken streets, the same failing schools, the same closed factories, the same gangs. The only thing that's changed is you got rich while we stayed poor." Another voice joined hers, a young man in work clothes. "Jerome Williams, born and raised in Willowbrook. You came to my high school in 2010, promised you'd bring jobs. I'm still waiting. So is everyone I graduated with who didn't leave or end up in prison. You show up for cameras when someone gets shot, make your speeches, then disappear until the next tragedy. We're not constituents to you, we're props." The testimonies continued, each one a dagger to Waters's claims of representation. A small business owner who had begged for help navigating regulations only to be ignored. A mother whose son was killed in gang violence who couldn't even get a meeting with Waters' staff. A teacher who had written dozens of letters about school conditions without receiving a single response. "But you do engage with your district in one way," Cruz noted, returning to his documents. "Every election cycle you remember, they exist. Let's look at your campaign spending in the district." The pattern was as predictable as it was cynical. In election years, Waters would suddenly flood the district with campaign events, mailers and advertisements, walking tours through neighborhoods she otherwise never visited, town halls in communities she otherwise ignored, promises of change that had been recycled so many times they should have had environmental warnings. "Your 2020 campaign spent $3.2 million, Cruz detailed. "How much went to vendors and businesses in your district? 75,000. Less than 3%. The rest went to consultants in Beverly Hills, media buyers in New York, and of course your daughter's company at that 1,000% markup we discussed. You don't even spend your campaign money in the community you claim to represent." But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source, other members of the Congressional Black Caucus. Cruz produced statements carefully worded but devastating in their implications from Waters' own colleagues. "I won't name names out of respect for their privacy," Cruz said. "But here's what your Democratic colleagues say about you in private. Quote, Maxine is an embarrassment. She gives ammunition to every stereotype about black politicians." Another quote, "She's the reason people think we're all corrupt. 30 years of self-dealing while her district burns. And perhaps most tellingly, the best thing she could do for black advancement is retire." The cumulative effect was overwhelming. 3 decades of neglect, documented in brutal detail. A district used as a political base, but never served. Constituents treated as votes to be harvested rather than people to be helped. And all while Waters enriched herself using the very poverty she had failed to alleviate as a platform for national prominence. "You're not a representative," Cruz concluded, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. "You're a poverty pimp. You profit from the pain of your people. You monetize their misery. You've turned their suffering into your success. And the saddest part, they keep voting for you because you've convinced them that anyone who points out your failures is racist, that any criticism of you is an attack on them. You've weaponized their loyalty while giving them nothing in return." He closed the final folder with the solemnity of someone closing a casket. 30 years of corruption, 30 years of self-dealing, 30 years of enriching your family while your district decayed, 30 years of siding with cop killers over cops, 30 years of inciting violence for profit, 30 years of betraying every principle you claimed to champion. The evidence is overwhelming. The pattern is undeniable. The verdict is clear. Cruz stood gathering the 6 sections of evidence that had systematically destroyed Waters' career. In Texas, we have a saying, "You can't ride 2 horses with one behind." You've tried to ride the horse of public service, while your behind was firmly planted on the horse of personal profit. Well, Representative Waters, that ride is over. The denouement arrived not with dramatic flourishes, but with the quiet certainty of justice too long delayed. Waters sat at the witness table like a boxer who had taken too many punches, no longer sure which way was up or where the next blow might come from. Her purple suit, so vibrant when she'd entered, with accusations of racism and elitism, now seemed to mock her with its brightness, like a parade uniform worn to a funeral her own. "Representative Waters," Cruz said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge about to pass sentence, "you entered this room calling me a racist. A Cuban wannabe white man, I believe, were your exact words. You accused me of being a Harvard elitist who doesn't care about poor people. You thought you could hide behind your race, your gender, your biography. You thought you could silence truth with volume, bury facts with accusations, escape justice with identity politics. You were wrong." He stood now, the accordion folder tucked under his arm like a prosecutor's brief. Each tab a count in an indictment that had been 3 decades in the making. Behind him, the seal of the United States Senate seemed to loom larger, a reminder that this was not just political theater, but a reckoning under the authority of the American people. "I've prosecuted cases before the Supreme Court," Cruz continued, his voice gaining the rhythm that had swayed justices and won championships. "I've faced down some of the best legal minds in America. But I've never seen corruption as comprehensive, as systematic, as shameless as yours. You didn't just steal money, though you certainly did that. You didn't just betray your constituents, though that alone should damn you. You corrupted the very idea of representation. You turned public service into private gain with an efficiency that would make the robber barons blush." Waters tried to stand, perhaps to storm out as she had planned, but her legs betrayed her. The weight of evidence had transformed from metaphorical to physical, pressing her down into her chair like gravity had suddenly doubled. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came. The woman who had made a career of sharp retorts and cutting accusations had been rendered speechless by the simple presentation of facts. "Sit down, Representative," Cruz said. Though it was unnecessary, Waters wasn't going anywhere. "We're not quite finished. You see, everything I've presented today, the bank fraud, the family enrichment, the protection racket, the support for terrorists, the incitement to violence, the abandonment of your district, all of it has been shared with the appropriate authorities. And they've reached some conclusions. He produced one final document from his jacket pocket, unfolding it with the care of someone handling scripture. The Department of Justice seal was visible at the top, and below it, the words that would end Waters' career more surely than any election: criminal referral. The Attorney General has authorized me to inform you that you are now under federal investigation for the following charges. Cruz read his voice carrying across the silent hearing room. Wire fraud, 17 counts. Campaign finance violations, 23 counts. Money laundering, 12 counts. Tax evasion, 8 counts. Operating as an unregistered foreign agent, 3 counts. Conspiracy to provide material support to designated terrorist organizations, 2 counts. And violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, 1 count encompassing the entire criminal enterprise you've operated from your congressional office. Each charge landed like a physical blow. Waters's face, which had progressed through anger, fear, and desperation, finally settled on something that might have been recognition, the dawning understanding that her long run was finally over. 66 federal charges, Cruz summarized, each carrying substantial prison time. The U.S. Attorney for the Central District of California estimates that if convicted on all counts, you face a potential sentence of 300 years. Of course, given your age, even a fraction of that would constitute life imprisonment. But then you've already imprisoned your constituents in poverty for 30 years, so perhaps there's poetic justice in that. The doors to the hearing room opened again, and this time there was no mistaking the intention. FBI agents entered in formation, their movements professional and practiced. Leading them was a special agent whose badge identified her as Sarah Mitchell, a black woman whose presence seemed to particularly unnerve Waters. I requested Agent Mitchell specifically, Cruz noted, a decorated agent with an impeccable record who also happens to be from Watts. She knows the communities you've betrayed. She's seen the devastation your neglect has caused. I thought it appropriate that someone who actually serves your district be the one to arrest you. Maxine Waters, Agent Mitchell announced, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. I have a warrant for your arrest on multiple federal charges. Please stand and turn around. This is racism. Waters finally found her voice, though it emerged as more shriek than speech. This is a lynching. You can't do this to me. I'm a member of Congress. I have immunity. Congressional immunity doesn't apply to criminal acts, Cruz noted with the patience of a teacher correcting a particularly slow student. It never has. You've hidden behind your office for 30 years, but that shield has limits. You've finally found them. Waters tried to run, then a desperate lunge toward the door that was both pathetic and inevitable. She made it perhaps 3 steps before Agent Mitchell and her team intercepted her with professional efficiency. The struggle that followed would be replayed endlessly on news channels, a 85-year-old congresswoman being wrestled to the ground, handcuffs clicking around wrists that had signed legislation and taken bribes with equal enthusiasm. "You can't do this!" Waters screamed as they pulled her to her feet. "Do you know who I am? I'm Maxine Waters. I've been in Congress for 30 years. I march with kings. I speak for the people." "The people you speak for are in this room," Cruz said, gesturing to the gallery where Waters' constituents stood watching. "And they're silent. No one is protesting. No one is defending you. Because they know what you are. They've always known. They just hoped that someday someone would have the courage to say it out loud and the evidence to prove it." As the agents began to lead her away, Waters made one last desperate play. "I have information about everyone. The whole Black Caucus, Democrats and Republicans. They all do it. I can give you names. Now she wants to make deals, Cruz observed to the room at large. For 30 years, she was untouchable. For 30 years, she was defiant. But put handcuffs on a criminal, and suddenly they remember how to cooperate. Too little, too late, Representative Waters. The time for deals was before you spent 3 decades daubing your community blind. As they dragged her past the witness table, Waters locked eyes with Cruz one last time. In that moment, all pretense fell away. The mask of the righteous crusader dissolved, revealing the corrupt politician beneath. Her face contorted with rage, so pure it seemed to age her another decade. "You destroyed me," she hissed. "No, Representative Waters," Cruz replied with the calm certainty of someone stating fundamental truth. "I documented you. You destroyed yourself the moment you decided that public service meant private gain. I just showed everyone what you've been doing in the dark for 30 years. The agents resumed their march toward the door, Waters' protests echoing through the marble halls. "My people will rise up. There will be riots. Los Angeles will burn. You'll see they love me." But the gallery told a different story. The constituents Waters claimed would riot, for her, stood in silent satisfaction. Some were crying, not tears of sorrow, but of relief. Others embraced sharing the moment when their long nightmare finally ended. And from somewhere in the back, a single voice began to sing. It was Angela Roberts, the 67-year-old woman from Watts, who had testified to 30 years of broken promises. Her voice, weathered by age, but strong with conviction, carried the opening words of "We shall overcome." One by one, others joined her. The teacher from Willowbrook, the business owner whose American dream had burned the young men who had watched their communities decay while their representative got rich. By the time the agents had dragged Waters from the room, the entire gallery was singing, not in protest, but in celebration. Not for Waters, but for themselves. For the first time in 3 decades, they had hope that someone might actually represent them, might actually fight for them, might actually see them as more than votes to be harvested and forgotten. Cruz stood silently as the singing continued, the accordion folder still under his arm, the evidence that had ended a career still spread across the table. When the song finally ended, he addressed the gallery directly. "To the people of the 43rd District," he said, his voice gentler now, the prosecutor giving way to the public servant. "You deserved better. For 30 years you deserved better. I can't give you back the time lost, the opportunities squandered, the promises broken. But I can give you this proof that in America no one is above the law, not because of their race, their gender, or their office. Justice may be slow, but it is certain." He began gathering the evidence, each document a piece of the puzzle that had revealed the truth. "In Texas, we have another saying, 'You can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear.' Maxine Waters spent 30 years trying to convince you she was silk when she was something else entirely. Well, now you know. Now everyone knows. And now, finally, you can choose someone who will actually serve you instead of themselves." As Cruz prepared to leave, a young reporter managed to reach him. "Senator, what message does this send to other corrupt politicians?" Cruz paused, considering his words carefully. "The message is simple. The truth will out. You can hide behind identity politics. You can scream racism. You can claim persecution. But if you're corrupt, eventually someone will build the case. Someone will gather the evidence. Someone will have the courage to present it. And when that day comes, all your shields will fail, all your excuses will crumble, and you'll face justice like anyone else. What about claims this was racially motivated? Another reporter called out. I prosecuted a corrupt politician who happened to be black, Cruz responded. Her race was her shield, not my target. I would have prosecuted her just as vigorously if she'd been white, Hispanic, Asian, or any other ethnicity. Corruption has no color, and neither does justice. As he walked toward the exit, passing the table where Waters had sat in arrogance just hours before, Cruz delivered one final observation to the assembled media. You know what the real tragedy is. Maxine Waters could have been great. She had the platform, the seniority, the opportunity to truly transform her district. Instead, she chose to transform her bank account. She could have been a champion for the poor. Instead, she became a parasite on their poverty. She could have been remembered as a civil rights icon. Instead, she'll be remembered as inmate number whatever they assign her. That's not racism. That's not persecution. That's justice. He paused at the door, looking back at the hearing room one last time. In Texas, we have one more saying, don't mess with Texas. Well, Maxine Waters messed with the truth, and the truth messed back. Court is adjourned. With that, he walked out, leaving behind a hearing room transformed into a courtroom, a political theater transformed into a hall of justice, and a 30-year career transformed into a cautionary tale. The accordion folder under his arm seemed lighter now, its contents having served their purpose not to destroy, but to reveal, not to persecute, but to prosecute, not to silence, but to speak truths too long left unspoken. Outside, the Washington sun shone bright and merciless, the kind of light that reveals every flaw and exposes every shadow. It was the same light that had finally found Maxine Waters, and under its glare, 30 years of corruption had nowhere left to hide. The cross-examination was complete. The verdict was rendered. Justice, patient and thorough and colorblind, had finally been served. In the federal detention center across town, Maxine Waters sat in a holding cell, her purple suit exchanged for federal gray, her congressional pin replaced with an inmate number. Her 30-year reign ended by 6 folders and a senator who refused to be silenced by the race card she'd played like a get-out-of-jail-free card for 3 decades. The card had finally been declined. The game was over. And somewhere in Watts, in Willowbrook, in Inglewood, in all the communities she had used and abandoned, people were already looking forward to representation that might finally actually represent them. Justice had taken 30 years to arrive. But when it did, it came with interest compounded daily payable, immediately in a currency Maxine Waters had never acknowledged: truth.